There was a time about 30 years ago when Sonic was at his arguable highest in popularity, the kind of fame that only is rivaled by the series' recent success. But after the initial Sonic boom that lasted from the release of Sonic 1 to Sonic and Knuckles, the series had a phase where it was struggling to get a new main series game off the ground and could only settle for a series of spin-off titles, while other consoles and mascots were popping up in the gaming industry like weeds. The poster child of this struggling Sonic era was the 1996 release of Sonic 3D Blast for the Sega Genesis and later the Sega Saturn. So I'm going to explore this often overlooked entry in the series today. You might wonder, haven't you technically talked about this game once before? The answer to that is yes. 5 years ago, it was a part of a video I did on this era of Sonic as a whole, but truth be told, I've never actually finished the game front to back before without level select cheat codes and hacks and such, so that video from years ago was more of an overview where I lovingly said, Sonic 3D Blast, more like Sonic 3D
belongs in the trash!
That ought to set the tone that I didn't really like 3D Blast and never did, but last year I was replaying all the Sonic games for new footage from their original versions, and when I got to Adventure 1's Sky Chase section, my mind drifted off, and I was like, you know, it might make an interesting video if I tried to force myself to play all of 3D Blast, so I back-pocketed the idea, and here we are. But as I just established, I have never liked 3D Blast at all, and I've had access to it for most of my life. If you recall, my first ever Sonic game was the Sonic Mega Collection Plus on PlayStation 2, where I was first exposed to Sonic 1, 2, and 3, alongside a bunch of other spin-off games. Sonic 3D Blast was one of the games included in that package, and while the name sounded kinda exciting, my 4 or 5-year-old self could just tell something was amiss with this game. Even though I could barely play the classic trilogy without constant game overs in the first 2 zones, I knew the games were good, even without the vocabulary to articulate why that was. But then with 3D Blast, I just knew it was not good, while also not having the words to describe why. It just wasn't that fun, so I never played it much. And then when I was older and had more of a solid idea on what games I liked and didn't, I was like, hell yeah, this game is bad. And anytime I tried to get through it just to say I did, I'd quit at some point of Rusty Ruins or Spring Stadium because I just felt bored. Which is basically what I said about 3D Blast in my video from 5 years ago. However, when looking back at the press of the time, the game was somewhat positively received, but its legacy is not so great now. So what happened? That is why I decided I was going to sit down, play through the whole game front to back, and make a retrospective on it and see what my final conclusion was. To start, we should go back to the beginning and see how it came to be. Sonic 3D Blast was not developed by Sonic Team or the Sega Technical Institute, the groups that made Sonic's 1, 2, CD, and 3K. 3D Blast was developed by British studio Traveller's Tales, the studio most known today for the LEGO game franchise, but before LEGO Star Wars came out, they developed various games while working with the IPs of other companies. Sega was pretty impressed with their work on the Toy Story game and wanted to recruit them to make a Sonic game for the Genesis, Sonic's final game on his console of origin. A game that was going to use the hardware to make gameplay that felt like 3D. Since this was the era where the gaming graphics arms race was at its most competitive, Nintendo and Sega were trading blows back and forth for who could have the best visuals and sound quality. 3D Blast was going to be one last big game on the system to show what it was truly capable of before Sega went full force in the next generation of consoles. And thus, Sonic 3D Blast, aka Sonic 3D Flicky's Island, was born. On the mysterious Flicky Island, there exists a species of birds that the island gets its name from. They travel through dimensions via warp rings and are connected to the power of the Chaos Emeralds. Dr. Robotnik has arrived on the island to trap the Flickies and his robots and go collect those Chaos Emeralds. Sonic also arriving on the scene to save the day. For the first time in any of these games, the story is explained to you in an opening cutscene with expository text. In all the previous games, to know the plot you need to read the manual. The instructions for 3D Blast do give more context on the story than the actual game, but this intro scene establishes more than any of the previous games did. From then to the ending, there is no story to follow, unlike Sonic 3 and Knuckles, which did tell a cool story throughout the game without using dialogue. So this game isn't as ahead of the curve as 3K, but I thought it was worth noting that there was an in-game story component before getting into the gameplay. Beginning in Green Grove Zone, Sonic's goal is to destroy the 5 badniks in every area, rescuing the Flickies trapped inside, and finding the warp ring and going to the next section before reaching the end of the stage, rinse and repeat throughout the game, and then it's done. To get into the gameplay more properly, it's important to establish that the 3D in the name is a bit of a misnomer. I figured I'd explain it in more depth because when I decided to rank all the 3D Sonic levels in a video last year, many objected to this game being left out because it literally has the word 3D in the name. My response was simply that it's not a 3D game, obviously, which was met with pushback, so I'm going to explain it. I guess there isn't a one-size-fits-all definition of a 3D game, but a 3D game like, say, Sonic Adventure sees you controlling Sonic in a 3D space with 360-degree movement on the analog stick. The world has three-dimensional depth and is fully rendered in 3D with polygonal graphics. An isometric game like Sonic 3D Blast is not any of those things. Its world has the depth of this drawing of a room I'm doing on screen. It doesn't have depth, it is just drawn with more perspective than a flat drawing. The artists responsible for this game make a 3D render of Sonic, inspired by the technology of Donkey Kong Country, turned poses from that 3D model into sprites the Sega Genesis could use so he looks like a 3D character and is running around like one, even if it's technically 2D sprites, and he's in a world that is flat, but drawn in a way to give more perspective and depth than is really there. Like Sonic Labyrinth on the Game Gear, another game they were inspired by. But don't worry, they weren't inspired by its riveting gameplay, just its camera perspective. So yeah, it's a 2D game drawn in a way to simulate 3D, and it's not a knock on the game. By the standards of the Genesis, this is a really impressive game, and the critics of the time echoed that sentiment across the board. Back when Sonic was the flagship series of Sega consoles, his games were meant to be fun, but also impressive tech demos for the hardware it was on, and 3D Blast was no different. But technically, it is not a 3D game, and thus was not in the ranking video. But don't worry, if you're a fan of this game, you wouldn't have wanted to see it included anyway, because with the criteria that video was working under and with the games it would have been competing against, this game would have gotten a 0 in every category, which leads swimmingly into the gameplay discussion. If the outline I gave on Sonic's objective didn't clarify it enough, this game is not a side-scrolling platformer. In fact, it can barely be described as a platformer at all because platforming in an isometric game with these controls would lead to disaster. So instead, the game is a scavenger hunt. Like I said, each area has 5 badniks and a flicky inside, and you need to rescue all of them. Green Grove Zone is probably not going to give you much trouble, and in fact it's the most enjoyable level in the game because it doesn't have a central gimmick to get in the way, nor does it have much in terms of frustration. What you'll notice is that the game makes it clear that Sonic's gimmick of jumping on robots to destroy them doesn't really work in anything other than a side-scroller. Jumping on enemies in this game can often be finicky because it will be difficult to really judge where your jumps are going to land. Rolling into most enemies was far more accurate. I will say, you do get used to it as you play. At least after a level or two, I didn't have much trouble with jumping into enemies a lot of the time, but when they were moving or suspended in the air, that always felt like a crapshoot. Something I'm sure the designers knew because the most useful upgrade in the game is the homing shield. This is basically the homing attack from the 3D Sonic games. You jump, press the button again, and you lock onto the enemy. But this is only a shield in 3D Blast, and will be taken away the moment you take damage. It was just lucky for me that, as I said, I didn't feel like I needed it a lot of the time. It was always the parts with enemies above you that gave me the most grief, like the boss of Green Grove Zone, which wasn't even difficult, I just always felt unsure if he was going to be low enough for an attack. But besides that, this zone is pretty smooth sailing, and I always thought it was. It was going into Rusty Ruins where I almost always lose interest. The core gameplay loop here is just not that fun. Sonic has to inch around areas to find robots to destroy, but Rusty Ruins is when the designers started to implement gimmicks to spice that up. Here, you need to step on these platforms to start spinning around and allowing you to destroy these pillars and go back to earlier areas to destroy pillars you couldn't before. Levels in 3D Blast are like these big loops where you find most, if not all, the enemies in a single run-through. But then each one will have a twist, like Rusty Ruins is spinning. But again, the game just gets really boring. And then it gets frustrating because when you take damage, the flickies you have will scatter around all over the place and you need to grab them up again. Some, like the blue and pink ones, will go and find Sonic to the best of their ability, but others, like the green ones, will actively leave or wander about. Sometimes you'll get hit in the process of trying to get them back, which is even more annoying on top of the game loop being kind of dull. But the part of Rusty Ruins I always remember the most clearly are these awful platforming sections. Sonic must jump over this moving platform, and trying to land on the thing is a nightmare because judging the distance of your jumps is really awkward. And it is equally so when the platforms are going in and out of the ground in this steep slope. That's why this game couldn't be a fast-paced platformer, because it controls like butt cheeks, which is why I always stopped here a lot of the time when I picked this game up in the last 20 years. The only part of the level I really vibe with is the music. In fact, I'm not sure if this is a hot take, but I feel like 3D Blast's soundtrack is my favorite of the Genesis Sonic games. Sonic series legend Jun Senoue did a lot of the work for this game, and these compositions are super catchy and sound great in the Genesis. Tracks from the later levels like Volcano Valley and Panic Puppet Zone have this atmosphere to them that gives the tracks more depth than anything the series did before in the Genesis. But then the tunes were so good that some of them came back for the soundtrack of Sonic Adventure, like Green Grove Act 1 getting remixed for Windy Valley Section 3, and Panic Puppet Act 1 getting used in Twinkle Park Section 1. A conversation about the music does naturally lead to a conversation about the Saturn port of the game that I mentioned towards the beginning of the video. But to explain why, we'd best back that ass up to the mid-90s. As established earlier in the video, Sonic 3D Blast was released at a time where the Sonic series was struggling to establish itself in the 3D era of gaming, while other franchises were making that shift much easier like Mario or Zelda. 3D Blast was only meant to be the series' swan song on the Genesis, not its first 3D entry. That was going to be Sonic Extreme, developed by the Sega Technical Institute for the Sega Saturn. STI developed Sonic 2 and 3, but the development of Extreme was an utter dumpster fire. How to properly make a 3D platformer was a completely unknown thing back then. Developers just made things up as they went along and stuck with what worked. So figuring out how to make a Sonic game with the series' signature speed while figuring out how to make a 3D platformer was a challenge to say the least. The game had engine issues running on the Saturn, among many other things. The higher-ups at Sega weren't happy with it, and the devs were crunching to the point of physical health risks. To top it all off, the game wasn't even that fun. When I was a kid watching YouTube all day, watching footage of this famously cancelled Sonic game made it clear as crystal how it didn't look fun. More recently, fan developers have recreated that game, and it was interesting to play, in that it proved the controls and gameplay ideas didn't really work. But yeah, Extreme was meant to be the big Sonic game of 1996, but it was eventually cancelled. Sega got Traveler's Tales to start working on a Saturn port of 3D Blast in the event Extreme got cancelled, which it did. Their whole marketing campaign shifted gears to make 3D Blast the big game of 96. Even changing the name of the tie-in movie from An Extremely Sonic Christmas to Sonic Christmas Blast. 3D Blast was now on the Genesis and the Saturn, and it got its own side game for the Game Gear called Sonic Blast, which also used pre-rendered 3D looking sprites. Though the less said about that game the better, it is truly awful, but I guess I can talk more about it in a very soon to be released video. So look forward to that. But yeah, 3D Blast got dumped onto the Saturn to make up for the cancellation of Sonic Extreme, but this game wasn't much of a consolation prize. As stated before, the game was technically impressive for a late-release Genesis game, but compared to what Crash Bandicoot was doing on Sony's PlayStation that same year with its actual 3D graphics and good gameplay, and especially next to Super Mario 64 on the Nintendo 64, which revolutionized 3D platformers and 3D action games as a whole, and this game doesn't hold a candle. It was never meant to. It wasn't supposed to be a flagship title to sell systems, and thus the Saturn port of the game was granted far less good press than its Genesis original because it just wasn't an impressive offering in this form. Personally, I don't think it was either way, but that's the bias of being a PS2 kid, I suppose. But looking at what the Saturn version does do, it has prettier graphics than the original, but not by much. It's the same game, only now there are weather effects in each level to create a distinct atmosphere for each one, and it comes with a CD quality soundtrack, though unfortunately not remixes of the original music. Instead, it's a fully original soundtrack by another prominent Sonic composer, Richard Jacques. It goes for a moody soundtrack over catchy, and that can have its place, and I think the music is good, but I just think the original is superior personally. The Saturn version does have a much clearer intro and outro cutscene, but this version also introduces loading screens that pop up on occasion, so I really think you're better off just playing the Genesis version. But, in the interest of being fair and balanced, this one does have better special stages, but I haven't even gotten to those yet, so...
Hold that thought.
To give the Saturn port something, it was the first time the game was released in Japan. The game came out in the US and Europe on Genesis in 1996, and the US box art sporting this 3D render that has that early 3D charm to it, while the European version having this demonic-looking 3D Sonic on its cover. The Saturn port also came to the US a few weeks later in November of 96, but then the European Saturn version didn't come out for another few months. And then, the game dropped on the Saturn in Japan in 1999, which was crazy to learn because Sonic Adventure for the Sega Dreamcast already came out in Japan in 1998. But it still uses the classic Sonic designs for the artwork, despite the worldwide redesign already being in use.
Now, where were we?
Oh right, the special stages. In every level you can find Tails and Knuckles in hidden spots, and instead of helping you save the day, they charge Sonic 50 rings to take him to a special stage. In the Genesis version, it's the same format as Sonic 2, where you need to collect a certain amount of rings before the checkpoint or else you lose. But it's night and day compared to that game. because the Genesis Sonic 2 had some of the toughest special stages in series history, but 3D Blast on Genesis is some of the easiest, next to, I don't know, Generations on 3DS. Each section gives you an incredibly high amount of rings, so failure feels almost impossible. Like, you may as well be on your way to getting 150 rings before passing the 100 ring checkpoint. And that goes for all of them, special stage 1 or 7, it doesn't matter. For the Saturn port, Sonic Team stepped in to make some new ones, and they're much better. It's the same concept of collecting rings before the checkpoint, but it's much more difficult and involved, requiring more reaction time to dodge the obstacles, which makes them far superior to play. This being one of the main draws of the Saturn version. The game's Windows port also came with its own special stages, but I never played these, so can't lie. But looking at footage of it on YouTube, it does show how funny this game's running animation looks at high speed. But I suppose there was a game I was talking about a few minutes ago, perhaps I should get back to that. Spring Stadium is the third zone, and like I was alluding to earlier, if I ever made it past Rusty Ruins in previous playthroughs, it was Spring Stadium where I'd start skipping levels with the password, because man, this is where the monotony really sets in. Rusty Ruins might give you the false impression that this game was going to be tossing out tough gimmicks like a machine gun. But Spring Stadium shatters that illusion because the entire level is just springs. That's the gimmick. Some parts will have a series of spring boxes on the ground, but only one of them will be real and the others will be fake. But they don't really do anything with that, like none of them are a threat. The fake ones just don't do anything. There are spiky grounds you can easily run past and balloons to jump on, but besides that, it is a 3D Blast level. You inch around and try to find the birds and get through, and it'll take over 10 minutes to clear the zone. Doesn't help that this zone is home to my least favorite music in the game, and the least appealing visuals too. Then Diamond Dust Zone is a really cool stage name and has banger music that got butchered 12 years later in a remix made for Sonic Chronicles The Dark Brotherhood, but then what this level adds to the mix is ice physics on select parts of the ground. Sounds a lot harder to deal with than it actually is though. If you jump instead of run, I felt like I was still in decent control of Sonic. The other new challenge here is that when bouncing on Badniks, the flicky will be trapped in ice, so you need to jump on 2 targets instead of 1. But it's not really adding much challenge, just an extra step to the process. It was also here where I got the 7th Chaos Emerald, so I was locked in to get the best ending. But I really disliked the bosses for both Spring Stadium and Diamond Dust, because I had trouble telling where the right angle to jump into Robotnik was, so that was fun. Volcano Valley, as I'm sure you can imagine, is more of the same. You'll want to hold onto a flame shield as best you can, because it will make you immune to the lava that you need to jump over and the flaming projectiles that come out of the lava as well. The spinning in Rusty Ruins, the springs in Spring Stadium, and the ice of Diamond Dust define those levels, but Volcano Valley doesn't really have a gimmick besides lava, which is a pretty simple obstacle to avoid, so it was the blandest level yet. Not helped by how I'm now 5 zones into a really bland and repetitive game. I mean, it has the spin dash platform rising mechanic from Lava Reef Zone from Sonic 3, but that's not really that exciting, and I even got crushed by it in Act 1. Gene Gadget Zone is one I always forget even exists. You're 6 zones into the game now and pretty ready for it to end. This one has a gimmick with fans that move you around and tubes you fly through and more Rusty Ruins tier platforming. It's not good, but it's the level I remember the least despite only playing it recently because I think I was in a fugue state or something while playing because I just bum rushed through and made it through just fine. It's more of the same monotony that's defined the entire game. Panic Puppet Zone Act 1 makes you collect the flickies from these capsule cages, but still that's not mechanically different from bouncing on enemies. Act 2 of Panic Puppet is unique because it's the only level in the game where no flickies are in sight, you just have to make it to the goal. That sounds like it would be cool, but instead it kinda shows off what's really wrong with this game. It's just fundamentally not that fun. There was a ROM hack I played of this many years ago where it removed the flicky collection element entirely, and I made it to Diamond Dust Zone before I put it down because then the game is just really boring because you run through these levels designed to be explored and now there's nothing to do in them at all, as shown by the game itself during Panic Puppet Act 2. The boss fight is also kind of annoying as you need to trick Robotnik into attacking, dodge, and then you hit his arms at the side when they're down, rinse and repeat throughout multiple phases where shit's flying all over the screen. Not a great fight, but if you get all 7 emeralds you unlock the true final battle, just with no Supersonic. I thought this boss was lame too. Sonic must dodge projectiles and then gets a chance to hit Robotnik. Repeat this for 5 phases and then repeat those 5 phases a second time and hope you survive. Especially annoying with that one where balls are flying all over the screen. It's really not worth playing mechanically, but if you are playing the game, the emeralds are so easy to get, you might as well just do it. Once you win, though, the day is saved, the island and the flickies are free, and Sonic Aura farms to an audience of no one in particular, thus ending Sonic 3D Blast. In the Saturn version, the game ends with this vocal song called You're My Hero from the perspective of the Flickies being rescued by Sonic. But with the style of music this song is going for, it wouldn't sound out of place on a 90s romance album, and it's kind of a bop. But even with that, the Genesis credits was also good too. At the end of the day, what did this video mean, though? Not that much, to be honest. It's not like poking fun at this game is a big deal or anything, it's almost 30 years old after all. But it is an interesting part of Sonic's history, as I went over when talking about its connection to Sonic Extreme. And I also just wanted to make this video as an excuse to document my finally authentically beating this game that I've owned in various forms for over 2 decades but never properly finished. I could have done it off camera, but I decided to do it in a video anyway, and I hope the folks at home enjoyed it. I kinda feel like it's been a while since I was just focused on game retrospectives and wanted to get my feet wet with it by making a review of a Sonic platformer I hadn't covered in much depth before. But yeah, it's 3D Blast. My opinion on it technically hasn't changed that much since the 2020 video, but now I have a proper video going in depth on it, and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. But even though I think the game is pretty mediocre, that doesn't have to be where the story ends for 3D Blast. As always, the Sonic community has stepped up to produce some pretty interesting results. First, you have the fully original fan game, Sonic 3D and 2D, which takes the concept of Team Sonic visiting Flicky Island and the level aesthetics and the music and remakes it from the ground up to be a 2D side-scroller that transitions the series from the classic era to the modern era with Eggman's design and even a mural of perfect chaos alongside the Hidden Palace mural. This is a pretty cool game, although I only played it once a few years ago, but I enjoyed it and think it's a solid 2D Sonic platformer. But more significantly, you have Sonic 3D Blast Director's Cut by John Burton, the founder of Traveler's Tales and the game director of 3D Blast. In 2017, he decided to revisit the work and create a ROM hack of 3D Blast that sought out to improve the experience, and I really respect it. With it, there's a faster ground speed, a better panning camera, a more active flicky tracker, a level select menu, a password screen to save your game, playable Supersonic where you get the emeralds, and other quality of life changes. I felt like these features were pretty cool and made the game better for sure. Well, besides that ugly light blue fur for Sonic that Mania established for classic Sonic, I will never like that. But besides the cool changes, it didn't really change the core gameplay loop, which was always my issue with the game. And that was beyond the scope of a ROM hack to fix anyway. So I wasn't expecting to walk away loving it, but I think it's great that this exists. It even comes with an option to play the original game, which is always appreciated. The link will be in the description. But that's about all I gotta say on 3D Blast. I'm glad I finally got this game off my list, and I hope folks enjoyed the video, because I have a lot of Sonic content coming up in July, including that big video I keep teasing. But until that time comes, I'll close by saying what I always do. If you made it this far into the video, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.